The wind came hard across the Montana plains, carrying dust and the smell of something long dead. Clara Vance pulled her coat tighter, her boots crunching over dried earth as she approached the ranch that looked more like a monument to failure than a working operation. The sign hanging crooked over the gate read, Mercer Ranch in faded letters, half the paint stripped away by years of weather and neglect. Beyond it, the land stretched out in all directions, beautiful once maybe, but now just empty. Hollow. Clara had seen places like this before, places where hope went to die. But she hadn't come here to mourn. She'd come to settle a score. She walked up the long dirt road toward the main house, her eyes scanning the property. A barn with a sagging roof, corrals with posts leaning at angles that defied physics, equipment rusting in piles like forgotten bones. And everywhere, the stench of rot. Not just wood and metal, but something deeper, something human. Grief, the kind that burrowed into a place and refused to leave. Clara stopped at the porch steps, her hand resting on the rail. The wood groaned under her touch, threatening to splinter. She looked up at the house. 2 stories, wraparound porch, windows dark and lifeless, and felt a pang of something she didn't want to name. Pity, maybe. Or recognition. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Clara exhaled, her breath misting in the cold air, and tried the door. It wasn't locked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was worse than the exterior. The front room was a disaster, furniture covered in dust, empty bottles scattered across tables, paper stacked in haphazard piles on every surface. The air smelled stale, like nobody had opened a window in months, maybe years. "Hello?" Clara called out, her voice cutting through the silence. Footsteps creaked overhead. A moment later, a man appeared at the top of the stairs. Dane Mercer. Clara had spent 5 years imagining this moment, but nothing could have prepared her for what she saw. He was tall, still tall, but leaner than she remembered. Harder. His face was all sharp angles and shadows, his jaw covered in several days' worth of stubble. His hair, once dark and neatly kept, now hung unkempt and streaked with gray. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. Empty. Completely, utterly empty. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Clara straightened her shoulders. "Clara Vance." He stared at her, no flicker of recognition. "We met 5 years ago," she continued, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Outside Billings. You pulled me out of a bad situation, saved my life." Dane's expression didn't change. "Don't remember." The words hit harder than she expected, but Clara didn't flinch. "I'm not surprised. You didn't stick around long enough for introductions." He descended the stairs slowly, each step deliberate, his hand trailing along the banister. When he reached the bottom, he stopped a few feet away, looking her over with the cold appraisal of a man who'd learned not to trust anything. "If you're here looking for money," he said flatly, "you're wasting your time. I don't have any." "I'm not here for money." "Then what?" Clara met his gaze head on. "I'm here to cook you a meal." For the first time, something flickered across Dane's face. Confusion, maybe. Or disbelief. "A meal," he repeated slowly, like the words didn't make sense. "1 meal," Clara clarified. "That's all I owe you." Dane stared at her for a long moment, then let out a short, humorless laugh. "Lady, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but it's not a game." "Then you're crazy." "Maybe," Clara admitted, "but I came a long way to do this, and I'm not leaving until it's done." Dane's jaw tightened. He looked like he wanted to throw her out, but something held him back. Curiosity, maybe. Or just exhaustion. "Fine," he said finally. "Cook your meal, then get the hell off my property." Clara nodded. "Where's the kitchen?" Dane gestured toward the back of the house without a word, then turned and walked away, disappearing down a hallway. Clara stood alone in the entryway, listening to the creak of floorboards overhead, the groan of wind against the walls. She took a breath, squared her shoulders, and headed toward the kitchen. The kitchen was a war zone. Dirty dishes piled in the sink, pots crusted with food left to harden, counters covered in grime. The stove looked like it hadn't been properly cleaned in months, and the icebox, when Clara finally pried it open, contained nothing but a half-empty jar of pickles and something that might have once been cheese. She stood in the middle of the room, hands on her hips, and surveyed the damage. Jesus, she muttered. This wasn't just neglect. This was surrender. Clara rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She started with the dishes, scrubbing each one until her hands ached and the water ran clear. Then she moved to the counters, the stove, the floors, cleaning every surface until the kitchen began to resemble something functional. By the time she finished, the sun had started its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the floor. Clara wiped her hands on a rag and stepped outside. The yard was quiet, but not empty. A few men lingered near the barn, their movements slow and purposeless. Ranch hands, she guessed, or what was left of them. She walked toward the barn, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust. The men noticed her immediately. 3 of them, all weather-beaten and worn, standing around like they had nothing better to do, which, judging by the state of the ranch, they probably didn't. "Afternoon?" Clara said, stopping a few feet away. The oldest of the 3, a man with graying hair and a face like old leather, gave her a long look. "You lost, ma'am?" "Not lost, just looking for supplies." "Supplies?" The man's eyebrows rose. "For what?" "Cooking." The 3 men exchanged glances. "Cooking," the older man repeated like it was a foreign concept. "Here?" Clara nodded. "Is there a storehouse, somewhere food's kept?" One of the younger men, a wiry kid with sun-bleached hair, spoke up. "Ain't much left. Boss stopped ordering supplies months ago." "Months?" Clara frowned. "What have you been eating?" The kid shrugged. "Whatever we can scrape together. Beans, mostly. Sometimes hardtack if we're lucky." Clara's frown deepened. "Show me the storehouse." The kid led her to a small shed near the barn. Inside, the shelves were nearly bare, a few sacks of beans, some flour, a tin of lard, and not much else. Clara ran her fingers over the meager supplies, her mind already working through possibilities. "This it?" she asked. "That's it," the kid confirmed. Clara nodded slowly. "All right, what about livestock? Chickens? Anything?" The older man who'd followed them over spoke up. "Got a few chickens left. Most died off last winter. Got some cattle out on the range, but the boss don't like us touching them unless he says. And vegetables? A garden?" The man snorted. "Garden died 2 years ago. Nobody's had the time or will to bring it back." Clara looked at the storehouse again, then back at the men. "What are your names?" "I'm Cole," the older man said. "This here's Jimmy." He gestured to the wiry kid. "And that's Hank." He nodded toward the 3rd man, a broad-shouldered guy who hadn't said a word. "Clara Vance," she introduced herself. "I'm going to need your help." Cole crossed his arms. "Help with what, exactly?" "Getting this place fed." Jimmy let out a low whistle. "Lady, I don't know what you think you're going to do with a sack of beans and some flour, but I think," Clara interrupted, that you boys have been surviving instead of living, and I'm going to change that." The men stared at her. "Tonight," Clara continued, "you're going to have a real meal, and tomorrow we're going to figure out how to keep having them." Cole's expression shifted, not quite belief, but something close. "You serious?" "Dead serious." Hank, the silent one, finally spoke. His voice was deep, gravelly. "Boss ain't gonna like this." "Boss doesn't have to like it," Clara said. "He just has to eat it." By the time dusk settled over the ranch, Clara had commandeered the kitchen and set to work. She wasn't a miracle worker, but she knew how to stretch ingredients. The beans went into a pot with water, lard, and a handful of wild onions she'd found growing near the fence line. The flour became biscuits, simple but filling. She coaxed 2 eggs out of the surviving chickens and scrambled them with a bit of bacon fat she'd discovered buried in the back of the storehouse. It wasn't fancy, but it was food, real food. The smell drew the men in like moths to a flame. Cole was the first to appear, followed by Jimmy and Hank. They stood in the doorway, staring at the table Clara had set with mismatched plates and utensils she'd scrubbed clean. "Sit," Clara ordered. They sat. She ladled beans onto their plates, added biscuits still warm from the oven, and spooned scrambled eggs on top. The men didn't move, just stared at the food like they weren't sure it was real. Well, Clara prompted. Eat. Jimmy picked up his fork hesitantly, took a bite, and his eyes widened. Holy hell! Cole and Hank followed suit, and for a few moments the only sound in the kitchen was the scrape of forks against plates. Clara leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching them devour the meal. A small, satisfied smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. This is... Jimmy trailed off, shaking his head. Ma'am, I ain't had food like this in years. It's just beans and biscuits, Clara said. Yeah, but it tastes like care, Cole said quietly. The words hung in the air. Before Clara could respond, the back door opened and Dane stepped inside. He stopped when he saw the scene, his men seated around the table, plates full, the kitchen filled with warmth and the smell of home-cooked food. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. What's this? He asked. Dinner, Clara said simply. Dane's gaze moved from the men to Clara, then back again. I didn't ask for this. I know. Then why? Because I owed you, Clara interrupted. And because they're starving. Dane's jaw tightened. For a moment, Clara thought he might kick her out anyway, but then Cole spoke up. Boss, the older man said, his voice careful, you should sit, eat. Dane looked at him, then at the empty chair at the head of the table. Slowly, reluctantly, he pulled it out and sat down. Clara filled a plate and set it in front of him without a word. Dane stared at the food. Then, finally, he picked up his fork and took a bite. The room went still. Dane chewed slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he took another bite, and another. Clara watched him, her heart pounding harder than it should have. When Dane finally looked up, his eyes met hers. Where'd you learn to cook like this? He asked, his voice rough. My mother, Clara said, before she died. Dane nodded slowly, then returned to his meal, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the Mercer Ranch kitchen was filled with something other than silence. It was filled with life. After dinner, the men lingered, talking quietly among themselves. Clara cleaned up, scrubbing plates and wiping down counters while they shared stories. Small things, mundane things, but spoken with a lightness that hadn't been there before. Dane stayed seated at the table, watching. When the men finally filed out, thanking Clara with awkward nods and mumbled gratitude, she found herself alone with him again. You don't have to stay, Dane said, breaking the silence. Clara turned to face him. I know. Then why are you? She considered the question, then shrugged. Maybe because I'm not done yet. You cooked your meal, debt's paid. Is it? Dane's eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? Clara crossed her arms. You saved my life 5 years ago. One meal doesn't come close to squaring that. I didn't do it for payment. I know, but I did it anyway. She paused. And now that I'm here, I can see this place needs more than one meal. Dane stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You don't know anything about this place. I know it's dying. The words landed like a slap. Dane's expression hardened. Get out! No. His hands clenched into fists. I said, I heard you, Clara interrupted, her voice steady. But I'm not leaving, not yet. Why the hell not? Because, Clara said, meeting his gaze without flinching, you're not the only one who's lost something, and I'm tired of running from it. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Finally, Dane exhaled, the fight draining out of him. He sank back into the chair, his head dropping into his hands. You don't understand, he said quietly. Then help me understand. Dane didn't answer. He just sat there, broken and silent, while the wind howled outside and the house creaked around them. Clara watched him for a long moment, then turned and walked toward the door. I'll be back in the morning, she said over her shoulder. And I'm making breakfast. She left before he could argue. That night, Clara slept in the barn. It wasn't much, a pile of hay in the corner, a scratchy blanket she'd found in the storehouse, but it was enough. She lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around her. She thought about Dane, about the emptiness in his eyes, about the men who'd eaten her food like it was the first kindness they'd received in years. She thought about her own past, the things she'd run from, the debts she'd never been able to repay. And she thought about the choice she'd made to come here. It had seemed simple at first. Cook a meal, settle the score, move on. But nothing about this place was simple. And something told her that leaving wasn't going to be an option. Not anymore. Clara woke before dawn, her body stiff from the cold and the hard ground. She stood, stretched, and made her way back to the house. The kitchen was empty, the remnants of last night's meal still on the counter. Clara relit the stove and got to work. She used the last of the eggs, fried up some bacon she'd found in the storehouse, and made more biscuits. By the time the sun crept over the horizon, the smell of breakfast filled the house. One by one, the men appeared. Cole first, followed by Jimmy and Hank. They sat without a word, plates in front of them, waiting. Dane came last. He stood in the doorway, watching Clara move around the kitchen with the ease of someone who belonged there. "You're still here," he said. "I am. Thought you'd be gone by now." Clara set a plate in front of him. "Thought wrong." Dane sat, his movements slow, deliberate. He picked up his fork, hesitated, then began to eat. The men followed suit, and once again, the kitchen filled with the quiet hum of shared meals and unspoken gratitude. When breakfast ended, Clara turned to Cole. "I need to see the books." Cole blinked. "The books?" "Financial records, ledgers, whatever you've got." Cole glanced at Dane, who said nothing. "They're in the office," Cole said finally. "But they ain't pretty." "I don't need pretty," Clara said. "I need honest." The office was a disaster. Papers everywhere, receipts mixed with bills, mixed with contracts, all of it buried under layers of dust and neglect. Clara sat down at the desk and started sorting. It took hours. By the time she finished, the picture was clear, and it was worse than she'd thought. The ranch was drowning in debt. Unpaid loans, overdue taxes, bills stacking up faster than revenue could cover them. And the income? Barely a trickle. Cattle sales had dropped off. Equipment repairs had drained what little cash reserves remained. Clara sat back, staring at the numbers. This wasn't just a struggling ranch. This was a death sentence. She found Dane in the barn, working on a broken fence post with the kind of slow, methodical movements that suggested he didn't really care if it got fixed or not. "We need to talk," Clara said. Dane didn't look up. "About what?" "About the fact that you're 3 months away from losing everything." That got his attention. He straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You went through the books." "I did. And?" "And you're broke. Worse than broke. You're buried." Dane's expression didn't change. "Tell me something I don't know." "Then why aren't you doing anything about it?" Clara demanded. "What's there to do?" "Fight." Dane let out a bitter laugh. "Fight with what? I've got no money, no credit, and no hope. This place is done. Not yet it isn't. You don't know what you're talking about." "Maybe not," Clara admitted. "But I know what giving up looks like. And I'm looking at it right now." Dane's jaw clenched. "You've been here 2 days. Don't pretend you understand." "I understand that you've got men depending on you," Clara interrupted. "I understand that this land is worth saving, and I understand that you're letting it all die because you're too scared to try." The words hit like a punch. Dane took a step toward her, his eyes blazing. "You don't know a damn thing about me." "Then tell me," Clara shot back. "Tell me why you're letting this place rot. Tell me why you've given up." For a moment, she thought he might actually answer, but then the fight drained out of him, and he turned away. "Just leave," he said quietly. "You've done enough." Clara stood there, watching his back, her hands clenched into fists. Then she made a decision. "No," she said. Dane turned, surprise flickering across his face. "I'm not leaving," Claire continued. "Not until I've done what I came here to do." "You cooked your meal?" "One meal isn't enough," Claire interrupted. "This place needs more than that. And whether you like it or not, I'm staying." Dane stared at her, disbelief and anger warring in his expression. "You can't just—" "I can," Clara said firmly. "And I am." She turned and walked away before he could argue, her heart pounding, her resolve hardening with every step. She didn't know if she could save this ranch, but she sure as hell was going to try. Over the next week, Clara threw herself into the work. She took inventory of everything, supplies, equipment, livestock. She talked to the men, learning their strengths, their skills, what they could contribute. She started mapping out a plan, piece by piece, figuring out what could be salvaged and what needed to be rebuilt. And every night she cooked. The meals weren't fancy. They couldn't be, not with the limited supplies, but they were consistent, warm, filling. And slowly things began to change. The men started showing up on time, working harder, talking more. Laughter crept back into conversations. Hope, fragile, tentative, began to take root. Dane watched it all from a distance, his expression unreadable. But Clara noticed the way he lingered at meals, the way he stopped objecting to her presence, the way, sometimes, his eyes followed her as she moved through the kitchen. One evening, after the men had gone to bed, Clara found him sitting on the porch, staring out at the dark expanse of the ranch. She sat down beside him without a word. They stayed like that for a long time, the silence comfortable, almost companionable. Finally, Dane spoke. "Why are you really here?" he asked. Clara considered the question. "I told you, I owe you." "That's not all of it." She smiled faintly. "No, it's not." "Then what?" Clara looked out at the ranch, at the shadows and the stars and the endless sky. "I needed to prove something to myself." "What?" "That I could still fight for something that mattered." Dane turned to look at her, really look at her, for the first time since she'd arrived. "And does it?" he asked quietly. "Matter?" Clara met his gaze. "Yeah," she said, "it does." Something shifted between them in that moment, something neither of them could name, but both of them felt. And for the first time in a long time, the silence on the Mercer Ranch didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. The morning air bit cold as Clara stepped out of the barn, her breath forming small clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. 2 weeks had passed since she'd arrived at the Mercer Ranch, and the rhythm of the place had started to settle into her bones. Wake before sunrise. Start the fire. Get coffee going before the men stumbled in, half asleep and hungry. She'd learned their patterns. Cole always came first, moving quietly so as not to wake the others. Jimmy liked his coffee strong enough to strip paint. Hank never said much before his second cup. And Dane appeared last, always looking like he hadn't slept, always keeping his distance even as he sat at the same table. Clara poured water into the kettle and set it on the stove, then started pulling out what supplies they had left. The storehouse was getting dangerously low. Another week, maybe 2, and they'd be down to nothing but air and wishful thinking. She'd been stretching meals as far as they'd go, but there was only so much magic she could work with dried beans and stale flour. The kitchen door creaked open and Cole walked in, his weathered face creasing into something almost like a smile when he saw her. "Morning," he said, his voice gravelly from sleep. "Morning. Coffee's almost ready." Cole settled into his usual chair, watching her move around the kitchen with the practiced ease of someone who'd made this space her own. "You're up earlier than usual." "Couldn't sleep," Claire admitted, measuring out the last of the coffee grounds. "Been thinking about supplies." Cole's expression darkened. "We're low. We're past low. We're running on fumes." "Boss knows, he just don't want to talk about it." Clara set the coffee pot on the stove with more force than necessary. "Well, he's going to have to. We can't keep feeding 6 people on nothing." 5, Cole corrected quietly. Clara turned to look at him. "What?" "We're 5 now. Tommy left last night." The words hit like a cold wind. "Left? Why didn't anyone tell me?" Cole shrugged, but his eyes were tired. "Because it don't matter. Men have been leaving for months. Tommy's just the latest. Said he couldn't take it anymore. Working for a ranch that can't pay, eating meals that barely fill the belly, watching everything fall apart." Clara gripped the edge of the counter. "How many have left?" "Since you got here, just Tommy. Before that?" Cole let out a long breath. "We used to have 12 hands. Now we got 4. 4, Clara repeated, the number sinking in like a stone. "Me, Jimmy, Hank, and a kid named Marcus who's out on the range checking fences. Won't be back for another few days." Cole stood, pouring himself coffee from the pot that wasn't quite ready yet. "This place is bleeding out, Clara. And I don't know how much longer the rest of us can hold on." Before Clara could respond, Jimmy burst through the door, his face flushed and his breathing hard. "Cole, we got a problem." Cole set down his cup. What kind of problem? South fence is down, looks like it's been down for a while. Cattle got out, maybe a dozen head, could be more. Tracks leading toward the ridge. Cole swore under his breath. How bad's the fence? Bad. Whole section collapsed. Gonna need serious work to fix it. Where's the boss? Still in the house, I think. Cole looked at Clara, then back at Jimmy. Get Hank. Tell him to saddle up. We need to round up those cattle before they scatter too far. Jimmy nodded and disappeared back outside. Clara crossed her arms. What can I do? Cole grabbed his hat from the peg by the door. Keep breakfast warm. This might take a while. He paused at the threshold. And when the boss comes down, tell him we need to talk. About everything. Then he was gone, leaving Clara alone in the kitchen with the smell of coffee and the weight of a ranch falling apart around her. She stood there for a moment, staring at the empty doorway, then turned back to the stove. The water was boiling. She poured it over the coffee grounds, watching them swirl and settle, dark and bitter. Just like everything else in this place. Dane appeared 20 minutes later, looking like he'd slept in his clothes, probably because he had. His hair stuck up at odd angles, his eyes were bloodshot, and he moved with the slow deliberation of a man carrying too much weight. Coffee ready? He asked, his voice rough. Clara poured him a cup and set it on the table. South fence is down. Cattle got out. Cole and the others went to round them up. Dane's hand froze halfway to the cup. How many? Dozen, maybe more. He closed his eyes, his jaw working like he was chewing on words too bitter to say out loud. Then he picked up the coffee and drank it in one long pull, not caring that it was still hot enough to burn. Anything else? He asked, setting the cup down harder than necessary. Clara met his gaze. Tommy left. Dane didn't react, didn't even blink, just stared at the table like it might offer him answers. Did you hear me? Clara pressed. I heard you. And? And nothing. Dane stood, his chair scraping against the floor. Men leave. It's what they do. Not if they have a reason to stay. Dane turned on her, his eyes flashing. And what reason would that be? The promise of meals they can barely stomach? The hope that maybe, just maybe, this place won't collapse before winter? The belief that someone actually gives a damn, Clara shot back. The words hung in the air between them, sharp and challenging. Dane's hands clenched into fists at his sides. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? I've been here 2 weeks, Dane. 2 weeks. And I can see what you refuse to look at. This ranch isn't dying because of bad luck or bad weather. It's dying because you've already given up. I haven't. Yes, you have, Clara interrupted, her voice rising. You sit in that house like a ghost. You watch your men work themselves to the bone for scraps. You let the fences fall and the cattle wander and the supplies run out, and you do nothing. Absolutely nothing. Dane took a step toward her, his face dark with anger. You think it's that simple? You think I can just snap my fingers and fix everything? I think you can try. I am trying. Are you? Clara challenged. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're just waiting for this place to die so you don't have to. The silence that followed was deafening. Dane's chest heaved, his breath coming hard and fast. For a moment, Clara thought he might actually hit something or someone, but then the fight drained out of him, and he sank back into the chair, his head dropping into his hands. You don't understand, he said quietly, his voice raw. I can't save this place. I've tried. I've failed. And I can't. His voice broke. I can't fail again. Clara's anger softened just slightly. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. What happened here, Dane? He didn't answer, didn't even look up. Tell me, Clara pressed gently. Help me understand. For a long time, Dane said nothing. Then finally, he spoke. My wife, he said, the words barely above a whisper. Sarah. She died 3 years ago. Clara's breath caught. How? Sickness. Started with a fever. Doctors said it was nothing, that it would pass. But it didn't. It got worse, and by the time we realized how bad it was too late. He lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She died in our bed, in the house we built together, and I couldn't do a damn thing to stop it. Dane, After she was gone, I tried to keep going, tried to run the ranch the way she would have wanted, but everything I touched turned to ash. The cattle got sick, the crops failed, the men started leaving, and He laughed bitterly. I just let it happen. Because what was the point? She was gone. The ranch was dying, and I was too tired to fight anymore. Clara reached across the table, her hand covering his. I'm sorry. Dane stared at their joined hands, his expression unreadable. You shouldn't have come here, Clara. This place is cursed, and everyone who stays gets dragged down with it. I don't believe in curses, Clara said firmly. I believe in choices. And right now you have a choice. You can keep letting this place fall apart, or you can fight for it. I don't have the strength. Then lean on someone who does. Dane looked up at her, something flickering in his eyes. Hope, maybe, or just the faintest ember of something that used to be hope. Before he could respond, the door burst open and Cole stumbled in, his face pale and his shirt stained with blood. Clara shot to her feet. What happened? Hank, Cole gasped, leaning against the doorframe. He got thrown from his horse chasing the cattle. Landed hard, real hard. He's hurt bad. Dane was on his feet in an instant. Where is he? Jimmy's bringing him in on a wagon. Should be here any minute. Clara's mind raced. I need water, clean cloths, anything we can use for bandages. Cole nodded and moved to help, but his legs gave out and he collapsed into a chair. You're hurt too, Clara said, noticing the way he held his side. Just bruised. Took a fall myself trying to help Hank. I'm fine. The hell you are. Clara grabbed a cloth and pressed it against the cut on Cole's forehead. Hold this. Don't move. She turned to Dane. I need you to get the water and bandages, now. Dane hesitated for only a second, then moved, his training kicking in even through the fog of shock. Minutes later, the sound of wagon wheels crunching over gravel filled the yard. Clara rushed outside, Dane right behind her. Jimmy had pulled the wagon up to the porch, and in the back, Hank lay motionless, his face twisted in pain. His leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and blood seeped through his pants where bone had likely broken skin. Help me get him inside, Clara ordered, her voice steady despite the panic clawing at her chest. Together, the three of them carried Hank into the house, laying him on the kitchen table since it was the only surface large enough and sturdy enough to work on. Hank groaned, his eyes fluttering open. Hurts, he managed, his voice thick with pain. I know, Clara said, her hands already checking his injuries. We're going to fix you up, but you need to stay still. She looked at Dane. I need whiskey, the strongest you've got. For him or for you? Dane asked, already moving toward the cupboard. Both. Dane returned with a bottle and Clara poured some into a cup, pressing it to Hank's lips. Drink! All of it! Hank obeyed, coughing as the liquor burned down his throat. Clara turned to Jimmy. Hold him down. This is going to hurt. Jimmy moved to Hank's shoulders while Cole, despite his own injuries, held Hank's good leg. Dane stood at the head of the table, his hands gripping Hank's arms. Clara examined the broken leg, her stomach turning at the sight of the bone pressing against skin. She'd seen injuries like this before, back when she'd worked in a mining camp, patching up men who'd been crushed or broken in cave-ins. She knew what needed to be done, and she knew it was going to be hell. Hank, look at me, she said, her voice calm and authoritative. I need to set this bone. It's going to hurt worse than anything you've ever felt, but if I don't do it, you'll lose the leg. Do you understand? Hank's eyes were wide with fear, but he nodded. Clara took a breath, steadying herself. Then she gripped Hank's leg and pulled. Hank screamed. The sound ripped through the house, raw and terrible. Jimmy and Cole held him down as he thrashed, his body trying to escape the agony. Dane's knuckles went white as he kept Hank's upper body from moving. Clara worked quickly, feeling for the bone, guiding it back into place. Sweat dripped down her face, her hands slick with blood, but she didn't stop. Finally, she felt the bone slide into alignment. Hank went limp, unconscious from the pain. Clara quickly splinted the leg using wooden slats and strips of cloth, binding it tightly to keep the bone stable. Then she cleaned and dressed the wound where the bone had broken through the skin, her movements practiced and efficient. When she finished, she stepped back, her hands shaking. Will he be all right? Jimmy asked, his voice small. Clara wiped her hands on a rag, leaving streaks of red. If infection doesn't set in, he'll live. But he won't be working for months, maybe longer. The room fell silent. Cole broke it first. We're down to 3 hands now. 2, Jimmy corrected quietly. Marcus ain't coming back. Got a telegram yesterday saying he found work in Wyoming. Better pay. Cole swore viciously. Dane said nothing, just stared at Hank's unconscious form, his face pale and drawn. Clara looked at the 3 men, at their exhaustion, their despair, their barely concealed fear, and felt something snap inside her. No, she said. They all turned to look at her. No, she repeated, her voice stronger. This ends now. Clara, Dane started. I said this ends now, Clara interrupted, her eyes blazing. We've lost men. We've lost cattle. We've lost time and money and hope. But we haven't lost everything. Not yet. What are you talking about? Cole asked. Clara crossed her arms. I'm talking about fighting back. I'm talking about stopping the bleeding and actually doing something to save this place. With what? Jimmy demanded. We got no money, no supplies, and now we're down to 3 people who can actually work. We've got more than that, Clara said. We've got land, we've got skills, and we've got something this ranch hasn't had in a long time, someone who refuses to quit. Dane's eyes narrowed. What are you proposing? Clara met his gaze head on. I'm proposing we stop playing defense and start playing offense. We find new revenue streams. We cut costs where we can. We work smarter, not just harder. And we do it together. That's a nice speech, Cole said. But talk don't fix fences or buy supplies. You're right, Clara agreed. So let's start with what we can control. The garden. It's dead now, but it doesn't have to stay that way. We plant vegetables, herbs, anything that'll grow. That cuts our food costs and gives us something to sell or trade. Takes time to grow a garden, Jimmy pointed out. Then we start now, and while we wait for it to grow, we look at other options. The chickens. We've got a few left. We focus on breeding them, building up the flock. Fresh eggs we can sell in town. Town's 2 days' ride, Dane said. Then we find closer buyers. Other ranches, trading posts, wherever there's a market. Clara turned to Cole. You said there's cattle on the range. How many exactly? Maybe 40 head, could be more scattered out there. Then we round them up, all of them, and we sell what we can spare. That gives us cash to fix the fences, buy supplies, and pay what we owe. Selling cattle now means less breeding stock for next year, Dane argued. There won't be a next year if we don't survive this one, Clara shot back. Sometimes you have to sacrifice the future to save the present. Dane's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Clara pressed on. We also need to look at what's broken and what can be fixed. The equipment, the buildings, the fences. We prioritize repairs based on what'll give us the most return. And we do the work ourselves. No more hiring outside help we can't afford. You're talking about a complete overhaul, Cole said slowly. I'm talking about survival, Clara corrected. And yeah, it's going to be hard. Harder than anything we've done. But it's possible. If we commit. If we work together. If we refuse to give up. She looked at each of them in turn. Cole with his bruised ribs and weathered face, Jimmy with his youth and uncertainty, Dane with his grief and reluctance. I can't do this alone, Clara said quietly, but I'm willing to try if you are. The silence stretched. Then Cole spoke. I'm in. Jimmy nodded. Me too. All eyes turned to Dane. He stood there, his expression unreadable, his hands clenched at his sides. Clara could see the war raging inside him, the fear of failing again, the weight of loss, the bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying too much for too long. But underneath it all, she saw something else. A spark. Small and fragile, but there. All right, Dane said finally, his voice rough. We try. Clara felt something loosen in her chest. Then let's get to work. The days that followed were brutal. They started before dawn and worked until long after dark, driven by desperation and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could turn things around. Clara took charge of the kitchen and the garden, turning the patch of dead earth behind the house into something that might one day grow food. She planted seeds she'd traded for in town, hauled water until her back screamed in protest, and fought against soil that seemed determined to reject everything she put in it. Cole and Jimmy focused on the fences, riding out each morning to patch the worst sections and keep the remaining cattle contained. It was slow, backbreaking work, made harder by the lack of materials and the constant threat of more collapses. Dane threw himself into everything else, fixing equipment, managing what little finances they had, dealing with creditors who called in debts with increasing frequency. Clara watched him work himself to exhaustion, saw the way he pushed past pain and fatigue like they were enemies to be conquered rather than signals to be heeded. And through it all, Hank lay in the bunkhouse, his legs slowly healing, unable to contribute anything but guilt and frustration. 3 weeks in, Clara stood in the kitchen staring at the last bag of flour, the final tin of lard, and a handful of withered potatoes. This was it, the end of their supplies. Tomorrow, there would be nothing left to cook. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to find Dane in the doorway, his face drawn and pale. "We need to talk," he said. Clara's stomach sank. "About what?" "About the bank. They're calling in the loan. We've got 30 days to come up with $3,000 or they foreclose." The number hit like a physical blow. 3,000? Plus interest. Clara sank into a chair. "We don't have that kind of money." "I know." "What about the cattle? If we sell them all, it won't be enough. Even if we get top dollar, we'd be lucky to clear 2,000. And that's if we can find buyers willing to pay fair price, which we won't." Clara's mind raced, searching for solutions, for options, for anything that might save them. But everywhere she looked, she found walls. "There has to be something," she said desperately. Dane shook his head. "I've looked at it from every angle. There's nothing. We're finished." "No." Clara stood, her hands flat on the table. "No, we're not giving up. Not now. Not after everything we've fought for. Fighting doesn't change math, Clara." "Then we change the fight." She grabbed the ledger from the shelf and flipped it open, her eyes scanning the numbers. "Who holds the loan?" "First Bank of Helena." "Why?" "Because banks are businesses, and businesses can be negotiated with." Dane let out a harsh laugh. "You think they'll just agree to extend our deadline out of the goodness of their hearts?" "I think they'll agree if we give them a reason to." Clara's finger traced down the ledger, stopping at a line item that made her pause. "This payment here, the one from 6 months ago. It's marked as late, but the interest charge doesn't match the contract terms." Dane leaned over her shoulder, frowning. "What do you mean?" "I mean they overcharged you, by a lot." She flipped back through earlier pages, checking calculations, cross-referencing dates. The more she looked, the clearer it became. "Dane, they've been overcharging you for years. Look at this. And this. The interest rates don't match what's in the contract. They've been skimming." Dane's expression shifted from resignation to something harder. Anger. "How much?" he asked quietly. Clara did the math quickly in her head. "At least $800. Maybe more." "That's fraud." "That's leverage." Clara closed the ledger, her mind already forming a plan. "We go to Helena. We confront them with the discrepancies. We demand they credit the overcharges against the loan and extend the deadline. And if they refuse, then we go public. We tell every rancher and business owner in Montana that First Bank of Helena has been cheating their customers. We make enough noise that they'll have no choice but to deal with us fairly." Dane stared at her, something like admiration flickering in his eyes. "That's risky." "Everything's risky at this point, but it's better than rolling over and dying." For a moment, Dane said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow morning, first light." That night, Clara lay awake in the barn, staring at the ceiling and trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. But mixed with the fear was something else: determination. She'd come to this ranch to repay a debt, but somewhere along the way, it had become about more than that. It had become about home, about family, about fighting for something worth saving, and she wasn't about to let it slip away without a fight. Dawn broke cold and gray over the ranch as Clara climbed into the wagon beside Dane. The horses stamped impatiently, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Behind them, Cole stood on the porch with Jimmy, both men watching with expressions that mixed hope and doubt in equal measure. 3 days there, Maybe 4 back, depending on weather, Cole said, handing up a canvas sack. Put together what supplies I could. Ain't much. It'll do, Dane said, taking the sack and tucking it under the seat. Clara pulled her coat tighter, her fingers already numb despite the gloves. She looked back at the ranch house, at the barn where Hank lay healing, at the garden she'd only just started to coax back to life. Everything she'd fought for over the past month sat vulnerable and exposed, and she was about to ride away from it. "You'll keep things running?" she asked Cole. "Best we can. But Clara..." Cole's weathered face creased with concern. "You be careful in Helena. Banks don't like being called out on their dealings. They got ways of making trouble for folks who push too hard." "We're already in trouble," Clara said. "Might as well make it count." Dane snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward. Clara gripped the seat to steady herself as they rolled down the long dirt road, the ranch shrinking behind them until it disappeared into the gray morning mist. They rode in silence for the first hour, the only sounds the creak of wheels and the steady clop of hooves against packed earth. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, brown and barren under a sky that promised snow. Clara watched the horizon, her mind turning over the plan, looking for weaknesses, for things she'd missed. "You've done this before," Dane said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Clara turned to look at him. "Done what?" "Fought banks, dealt with businessmen. You move like someone who knows how these things work." Clara was quiet for a moment, weighing how much to tell him. "My father owned a mine, silver operation down in Nevada. When I was 17, the bank that held his loan started changing the terms, raising interest rates, calling in debts early, adding fees that weren't in the contract. My father tried to fight it legally, but he didn't have the money for lawyers. Within a year, they'd taken everything." "What happened to him?" "He put a bullet in his head rather than face losing the mine." The words came out flat, factual, emptied of the emotion that had once accompanied them. "I found him in his office, still had the contract in his hand." Dane's hands tightened on the reins. "I'm sorry." "Don't be. It taught me something important." Claire's voice hardened. "Banks count on people being too scared or too ignorant to fight back. They hide their fraud in fine print and complicated math, betting that nobody will look close enough to see it. But if you know what to look for, if you're willing to stand up and make noise, they back down. Because the last thing they want is public scrutiny." "And if they don't back down?" Clara met his gaze. "Then we make them wish they had." The first day passed slowly, the monotony of travel broken only by brief stops to rest the horses and eat what little food they'd brought. They spoke in fragments, sharing pieces of their past like cards in a cautious game. Clara learned that Dane had built the ranch from nothing, that he and Sarah had planned every building, every fence line, every detail together. She learned about the years of good harvests and fair prices, about the slow accumulation of debt as they expanded, about the way everything had fallen apart after Sarah died. And Dane learned about Clara's years of drifting, about the jobs she'd taken and lost, the towns she'd passed through without leaving a mark. He learned about the night in Billings when she'd gotten caught in the crossfire of a saloon fight, and how a stranger had pulled her out before the bullets could find her. How she'd turned to thank him and found only empty air, the man already gone. "I didn't even know your name," Clara said as the sun began its descent. "Spent 2 years tracking down stories, following rumors, until I finally found someone who recognized the description. Took me another 3 years to work up the courage to actually come find you." "Why?" Dane asked. "Why spend 5 years chasing down a stranger?" Clara watched the darkening sky, considering her answer. "Because you were the first person in a long time who'd helped me without wanting something in return, and I needed to believe that kind of thing still existed in the world." They made camp that night in a shallow ravine that offered some protection from the wind. Dane built a small fire while Clara rationed out beans and hardtack, the meager meal a reminder of exactly why they were making this journey. They ate quickly, not speaking, then rolled out their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire. Clara lay awake long after Dane's breathing had steadied into sleep, staring up at the stars scattered across the black expanse of sky. She thought about the ranch, about Cole and Jimmy holding down a property that was coming apart at the seams. She thought about Hank lying helpless in the bunkhouse, about Tommy and Marcus and all the others who'd given up and walked away. She thought about the ledger tucked safely in her bag, about the numbers that didn't add up, about the confrontation waiting for them in Helena. And she thought about Dane sleeping on the other side of the dying fire, about the way grief had carved hollows in his face, about the tiny spark of fight she'd seen flickering back to life in his eyes. Sleep came eventually, but it was thin and restless, filled with dreams of numbers and debt and buildings crumbling into dust. The second day brought the first snow. It started as scattered flakes, beautiful and delicate, drifting down from a sky gone white and featureless. By noon, it had thickened into a steady curtain that reduced visibility to a few dozen yards and covered the ground in a blanket that made the wheels struggle. "We need to find shelter," Dane said, his voice tight with concern. "This keeps up, we'll be stuck." They pushed on for another hour before spotting a line of trees marking what had to be a creek bed. Dane guided the wagon into the relative protection of the cottonwoods, and they quickly set up a rough camp, stringing canvas between trees to create a windbreak. Clara gathered what dry wood she could find while Dane tended the horses, rubbing them down and covering them with blankets to keep them warm. By the time she got a fire started, her hands were so cold she could barely feel her fingers. They huddled close to the flames, shoulders nearly touching, sharing body heat as much as the warmth of the fire. The snow fell harder, building up on the canvas above them, muffling all sound until the world seemed to consist of nothing but the small sphere of light and warmth they'd created. "Tell me about her," Clara said quietly. "Sarah." Dane stared into the fire for so long, Clara thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice rough with memory. "She was strong, stronger than me in most ways. When we first started the ranch, I wanted to play it safe, build slow. She's the one who pushed us to expand, to take risks. Said if we were going to do it, we should do it right." He smiled faintly. Was usually right about things like that. "What did she look like?" "Red hair, bright red, like copper in the sun. She hated it when she was young, but I loved it. Could spot her anywhere." His smile faded. "She was so damn alive, Clara. Everything she did with this intensity that made you feel like you were living twice as hard just being near her. She sounds remarkable. She was. And when she got sick, when I watched her fade day by day, getting weaker and paler and more fragile," his voice broke. "I couldn't save her, couldn't do a damn thing but hold her hand and watch her die." Clara reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "You were there, that's something. It wasn't enough. It never is. But it's what we have." Clara squeezed his hand. "My mother died slowly too, cancer. Took 3 years, and every day I thought I should be doing more. Should be finding some miracle cure, some way to fix her. But all I could do was sit with her, make her comfortable, tell her she wasn't alone. Did it help? I don't know, but I'm glad I did it anyway." They sat in silence, hands clasped, watching the snow fall and the fire burn. Somewhere in the distance a wolf howled, the sound lonely and wild. Dane's thumb moved in small circles against Clara's palm, an unconscious gesture that sent warmth spreading through her chest. "I'm scared," he admitted quietly. "Of failing again. Of letting everyone down. Of proving that I'm exactly as worthless as I feel." "You're not worthless. You don't know that." "Yes, I do." Clara turned to face him. "Worthless men don't pull strangers out of danger. They don't build ranches from nothing. They don't inspire the kind of loyalty I see in Cole and Jimmy and even Hank. You're hurt, Dane. You're grieving. But you're not worthless." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Clara saw something shift in his expression. The walls he'd built around himself, the armor he wore against feeling anything at all, cracked just slightly. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You could have left after that first meal, could have walked away a dozen times since, but you stayed. Why?" Clara didn't have an easy answer. The debt she'd claimed to owe felt like a thin excuse now, a justification for something deeper she couldn't quite name. So she told him the truth. "Because I stopped wanting to leave." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Dane's eyes searched her face, looking for something, and Clara held his gaze without flinching. Then Dane leaned forward and kissed her. It was tentative at first, almost questioning, like he wasn't sure he had the right. But Clara kissed him back, her free hand coming up to cup his jaw, and felt him relax into it. The kiss deepened, became something more urgent, more necessary, like they were both trying to fill the hollow spaces inside themselves with this connection, this moment of warmth in the cold. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Dane rested his forehead against hers. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered. "Do what?" "Feel something again. Want something again. It's been so long and I'm so damn tired and I don't—" "Then don't," Clara interrupted gently. "Don't think about tomorrow or next week or next year. Just be here, right now, with me." Dane's arms came around her, pulling her close, and Clara let herself sink into the embrace. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped around each other, listening to the wind howl and the fire crackle and the snow fall soft and silent around their small shelter. Eventually they lay down together, sharing blankets and body heat. Clara's back pressed against Dane's chest, his arm wrapped around her waist. She felt safe in a way she hadn't in years, anchored by his presence, his warmth, his steady breathing against her neck. "Clara," Dane murmured, already half asleep. "Yeah? Thank you for not giving up on me." Clara laced her fingers through his. "Thank you for being worth it." They slept tangled together while the storm raged outside, two broken people finding shelter in each other. Morning brought clear skies and a world transformed into white stillness. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving everything covered in a pristine blanket that sparkled in the early light. Clara woke to find Dane already up, coaxing the fire back to life and melting snow for coffee. They didn't talk about the night before, didn't analyze it or question it. They simply moved around each other with a new ease, a comfort that hadn't been there before. Small touches and glances replacing words. The wagon struggled through the snow-covered trail, but they made steady progress. By midday, the sun had come out in full force, turning the snow to slush and making the going easier. They passed other travelers, a freight wagon heading south, a family in a covered wagon bound for somewhere west, and each time Dane nodded in greeting but didn't stop. Helena appeared on the horizon late in the afternoon of the third day. It sprawled across a valley, buildings clustered tight and rising in tiers against the hillside, smoke from 100 chimneys smudging the sky. Clara had been to Helena once before, years ago, and remembered it as loud and rough, a city built on gold and silver and the men who'd die for both. They found a boarding house on the edge of town, cheap and clean enough. The landlady, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Patterson, showed them to two small rooms on the second floor. "Supper's at 6, breakfast at 7, she said, looking them over with frank appraisal. "Payments up front, and no funny business under my roof." Clara handed over coins they couldn't really spare. "We'll be on our best behavior." Mrs. Patterson sniffed, clearly unconvinced, but took the money and left them alone. Clara's room was barely larger than a closet, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a window that overlooked the muddy street. She set down her bag and pulled out the ledger, spreading it on the bed and reviewing her notes one more time. The numbers were solid, the evidence was clear, but knowing she was right and getting the bank to admit it were two very different things. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Dane, cleaned up and looking more alert than he had in weeks. "Bank will be closed by now," he said, "but I thought we could scout it out, see what we're dealing with." They walked through Helena's streets as the sun began to set, painting the buildings in shades of orange and gold. The First Bank of Helena occupied a corner lot on Main Street, a two-story brick building that projected solidity and permanence. Through the windows, Clara could see clerks moving about, closing out the day's business. "Big operation," Dane observed, his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. "The bigger they are, the more they have to lose," Clara said. "Come on, let's get something to eat. We'll need our strength tomorrow." They found a restaurant that served passable stew and better whiskey. The place was crowded with miners and merchants, their voices loud and boisterous, filling the air with the sound of men spending money they'd probably regret spending come morning. Clara and Dane found a table in the back corner, away from the worst of the noise. "You nervous?" Dane asked, nursing his whiskey. "Terrified," Clara admitted, "but I won't let them see it." "What's the play? We walk in and accuse them of fraud?" "Not exactly." Clara leaned forward, keeping her voice low. "We ask to speak with whoever manages loans. We present our case calmly, professionally. We show them the discrepancies and ask for an explanation. Give them a chance to make it right quietly. And when they refuse, then we escalate. We demand to see the bank president. We make it clear that we have documentation and we're prepared to take it public. We make them understand that fixing this is cheaper than the alternative. Dane swirled the whiskey in his glass. You really think it'll work? I think we don't have any other choice. They finished their meal in contemplative silence, then walked back to the boarding house through streets that had come alive with evening activity. Saloons spilled light and music into the night. Women in bright dresses called out to passing men. Somewhere a fight broke out, voices raised in anger before being quickly silenced. At the boarding house, they paused at the top of the stairs between their rooms. Clara, Dane said, catching her hand, whatever happens tomorrow, we'll face it together, she said firmly. All of it. He pulled her close, kissing her with a desperation that spoke of fear and hope tangled together. Clara kissed him back just as fiercely, pouring everything she couldn't say into that connection. When they finally parted, both breathing hard, Dane rested his forehead against hers. I don't deserve you, he whispered. That's not your call to make, Clara said. Now get some sleep. Tomorrow we fight. She slipped into her room before her resolve could waver, closing the door and leaning against it. Her heart pounded in her chest, her lips still tingling from Dane's kiss. She pressed her fingers to her mouth, trying to memorize the feeling, knowing that tomorrow everything could fall apart. But tonight, she let herself have this. Let herself feel wanted and needed, and like maybe she'd finally found a place worth fighting for. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, her dreams were full of possibility instead of fear. Morning arrived too quickly. Clara dressed carefully, choosing her most respectable clothes, pinning her hair back in a neat bun. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and barely recognized the woman staring back. Somewhere between arriving at the ranch and this moment, she'd stopped looking like a drifter and started looking like someone with purpose. She met Dane downstairs. He'd shaved and put on his best shirt, though it was worn at the cuffs and collar. Together they looked like what they were, ranchers barely scraping by, trying to maintain dignity in the face of ruin. Ready? Dane asked. Clara picked up the ledger, holding it like a weapon. Let's go. The bank was already open when they arrived, clerks behind brass-barred windows processing transactions with practiced efficiency. The interior smelled of paper and ink and old money, everything polished and proper and designed to intimidate. Clara walked up to the nearest clerk, a young man with spectacles and slicked-back hair. We need to speak with the loans manager. The clerk looked them over with barely concealed disdain. Do you have an appointment? No, but then you'll need to make one. Mr. Morrison is very busy. This concerns a discrepancy in our loan terms, Clara said, her voice steady and professional. I'm sure Mr. Morrison would want to address it promptly. The clerk's expression flickered with something that might have been concern. What kind of discrepancy? The kind that requires privacy to discuss. Please inform Mr. Morrison that Dane Mercer is here regarding the loan on Mercer Ranch. The mention of a specific loan seemed to shift the dynamic. The clerk excused himself and disappeared through a door behind the counter. Clara and Dane waited, standing in the middle of the bank floor while other customers moved around them, conducting business with the ease of people who belonged there. The clerk returned after several minutes. Mr. Morrison will see you. Follow me. They were led through a maze of corridors to a wood-paneled office where a portly man in an expensive suit sat behind an oak desk. He stood as they entered, extending a hand that neither Clara nor Dane took. Mr. Mercer, he said, recovering smoothly from the snub. I'm Samuel Morrison. Please sit. How can I help you today? Clara and Dane settled into the chairs across from Morrison's desk. Clara opened the ledger, laying it flat so he could see the pages. We've been reviewing our loan documents, she began, and we found significant discrepancies between the interest rates specified in our contract and the rates we've actually been charged. Morrison's smile didn't waver, but something hardened in his eyes. I'm sure there's a simple explanation. The explanation is fraud, Clara interrupted calmly. You've been overcharging us for at least 4 years. By our calculations, approximately $800 worth of illegal interest and fees. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Morrison's smile vanished entirely. Those are serious accusations, miss. Vance, Clara Vance, and yes, they are serious, which is why we're here to resolve this quietly before it becomes a legal matter. Morrison leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. And what exactly do you want? We want the overcharges credited against our loan principal, Dane said, speaking for the first time. And we want the foreclosure deadline extended by 6 months. Impossible. Then we'll take our evidence to the territorial attorney, Clara said, along with a letter to every newspaper in Montana detailing how First Bank of Helena has been systematically defrauding ranchers and farmers. I imagine that kind of publicity would be very bad for business. Morrison's face flushed red. You're bluffing. Clara closed the ledger and stood. Try us. She turned to leave, Dane following, and they were almost to the door when Morrison spoke again. Wait. They stopped. Morrison looked like he'd bitten into something rotten. Let me review your documentation. If there have been errors in calculating interest, we'll certainly correct them. And the extension? Clara pressed. I'll need to consult with the bank president, but if your numbers are accurate, I'm sure we can come to an arrangement. Clara set the ledger back on his desk. We'll wait. Morrison's jaw tightened, but he opened the ledger and began reviewing the pages, his finger tracing down columns of numbers. The silence stretched, broken only by the tick of the clock on the wall and Morrison's increasingly heavy breathing. Finally, he looked up. There do appear to be some discrepancies in the interest calculations. $800 worth, Clara said. I'll need to verify the exact amount. We already did. It's $812. Morrison's nostrils flared, but he didn't argue. Very well. I'll credit that amount against your loan principal and extend your deadline by 3 months. 6 months, Dane said firmly. Mr. Mercer, you're in no position to negotiate. Neither are you, Clara cut in. The moment we walk out of here without an agreement, we go straight to the newspapers. 6 months. That's our offer. Morrison stared at them, calculations running behind his eyes. Finally, he nodded curtly. 6 months. I'll have the documents drawn up by this afternoon. We'll wait, Claire repeated. They sat in Morrison's office for the next 3 hours while he arranged paperwork, consulted with the bank president, and generally did everything he could to make the process as unpleasant as possible. But by the time the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Clara and Dane walked out of First Bank of Helena with new loan documents that gave them until spring to save the ranch. They made it 2 blocks before the reality hit them. Dane stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, looking down at the papers in his hands like he couldn't quite believe they were real. We did it, he said, his voice barely audible. Clara felt something break loose in her chest, a flood of relief and triumph and exhaustion all mixed together. Yeah, we did. Dane turned to her, his eyes bright with something she hadn't seen there before. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around right there on Main Street while Clara laughed, clutching his shoulders for balance. When he set her down, he kissed her hard and deep, not caring who saw, not caring about anything except this moment, this victory, this impossible hope they'd fought for and won. When they finally broke apart, both grinning like fools, Clara saw people staring at them with expressions ranging from amusement to disapproval. She didn't care. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, she felt like they might actually have a chance. They spent that night in Helena celebrating with a bottle of whiskey they couldn't afford and didn't care about. In Clara's small room at the boarding house, they sat on the narrow bed, passing the bottle back and forth, their voices low and intimate as they talked about the future in a way neither had dared to before. 6 months, Dane said, taking a long pull from the bottle. That's not much time. It's enough, Clara insisted, the whiskey warming her from the inside. We sell half the cattle, use that money to buy supplies and fix the critical infrastructure. We get the garden producing, build up the chicken flock, maybe even look into other revenue streams. Like what? I don't know yet, but there's got to be something, some way to diversify beyond just cattle. Clara took the bottle from him, her fingers brushing his. We make it through spring, prove to the bank we're viable, and they'll have to extend the loan again. Dane's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. When did you start saying we? Clara's breath caught. She hadn't even noticed the shift. The way she'd stopped thinking of the ranch as Dane's problem and started thinking of it as theirs. I don't know, somewhere between the garden and the bank, I guess. Clara, I need you to understand something. Dane's voice was serious, his eyes searching hers. If you stay, if you keep fighting for this place, there's no guarantee it'll work. We could lose everything, the ranch, the money, all of it. I know. And you're willing to risk that? Clara set down the bottle and took both his hands in hers. Dane, I've spent 5 years drifting from place to place with nothing to lose because I had nothing worth keeping. For the first time in my life, I've found something worth fighting for. So yeah, I'm willing to risk it. He kissed her then, deep and desperate, and Clara felt something click into place inside her chest. This wasn't about debt anymore. Wasn't about obligation or gratitude or repaying old favors. This was about choosing a life, a place, a person, and fighting like hell to keep them. They made love that night with a tenderness that surprised them both, finding comfort and connection in each other's bodies, in the warmth of skin and the whisper of breath and the quiet promises neither of them spoke aloud but both understood. Afterwards, lying tangled together in sheets that smelled of lavender and hope, Clara traced patterns on Dane's chest and let herself imagine a future that didn't end in loss. "Tell me about the ranch when it was good," she said softly. Dane's arm tightened around her. "We used to have dances. Every harvest, Sarah would organize this big celebration. We'd clear out the barn, bring in musicians from town, invite everyone from miles around. The whole place would come alive with music and laughter, and people who actually wanted to be there." Sounds beautiful. It was. Sarah loved those nights. She'd dance until her feet hurt, and then dance some more. His voice went quiet. "I haven't had music in that barn for 3 years. Clara pressed a kiss to his shoulder. "Maybe we bring it back. When we save the ranch, when things are stable again, we throw the biggest damn dance Montana's ever seen. You think we'll get there?" "I think we have to believe we will. Otherwise, what's the point?" Dane turned to face her, his hand sliding into her hair. "I love you, Clara Vance. I don't know when it happened or how, but I do." The words hit Clara like a physical force, stealing her breath and making her heart stutter. She'd been loved before, or thought she had, but never like this, never with this bone-deep certainty, this absolute knowing. "I love you too," she whispered, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. They left Helena at first light the next morning, the new loan document safely tucked in Clara's bag. The journey back seemed shorter, fueled by hope and purpose, and the knowledge that they'd won a battle, even if the war was far from over. They talked constantly, planning and strategizing and dreaming out loud about what the ranch could become. Dane shared ideas he'd buried under grief. Clara offered perspectives shaped by her years of watching operations fail and succeed. Together they built a vision of something sustainable, something that could weather the storms to come. But when they crested the final rise and the ranch came into view, the celebration died in their throats. Smoke rose from the barn in thick black columns. "No," Dane breathed, snapping the reins hard. The horses surged forward, the wagon bouncing dangerously over the rutted road as they raced toward the flames. Men were running everywhere, hauling buckets from the well, throwing water on the blaze with desperate urgency. Clara could see Cole directing the effort, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. Jimmy was on the barn roof, beating at smaller fires with a wet blanket. Dane didn't even wait for the wagon to stop fully. He jumped down and sprinted toward the chaos, Clara right behind him. "What happened?" Dane shouted at Cole. "Lantern got knocked over about an hour ago," Cole yelled back, his face black with soot. "We got the horses out, but the hay's all going up. If we can't get it under control, the whole damn thing's going to collapse." Clara looked around frantically, assessing the situation. The fire was concentrated in the hayloft, flames licking at the support beams. The structure was old, dry as kindling. If those beams went, the whole barn would come down. "We need to create a fire break," Clara said, grabbing Dane's arm. "Pull down the fence between the barn and the house. If the barn goes, at least we can stop it from spreading." Dane's eyes were wild with panic, but he nodded. "Cole, get everyone on that fence. Jimmy, get off that roof before it kills you." They worked like demons possessed, tearing down fence posts, hauling away anything flammable, throwing bucket after bucket of water on the flames. Clara's arm screamed in protest, her lungs burning from smoke. But she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. She thought about the supplies they'd stored in the barn, the equipment they couldn't afford to replace, the months of work that were going up in flames. Then the roof collapsed. It went with a roar like thunder, timbers crashing down in an explosion of sparks and heat. Men scattered, diving for cover as debris rained down around them. Clara felt someone tackle her, driving her to the ground and covering her body with his own as burning wood fell where she'd been standing. When the rain of fire stopped, she looked up to find Dane on top of her, his back smoking where embers had hit his coat. "You all right?" he asked urgently. "Yeah, you?" "Fine, stay down." But Clara was already pushing to her feet, her eyes on the barn, or what was left of it. The structure was gutted, walls still standing, but the interior a blackened ruin. Smoke continued to rise, but the flames had mostly died with the roof collapse. They'd lost it, lost everything that had been inside. Cole appeared beside them, his face a mask of soot and exhaustion. "Horses are safe. Got them into the far corral. But everything else—" He shook his head. "I'm sorry, boss. I'm so sorry." Dane stood frozen, staring at the wreckage of his barn, and Clara could see him shutting down, the light that had burned so bright in Helena dimming to nothing. "How many horses did we save?" she asked Cole, her voice steady even as her insides churned with despair. "All of them, 6 total." "Equipment?" "Whatever was outside. The stuff in the barn is gone. Harnesses, tools, winter feed for the cattle, all gone." Clara did the math in her head and felt her stomach drop. The money from the cattle sale was supposed to buy supplies and fix infrastructure. Now they'd have to replace everything they'd just lost, which meant they were back to having nothing. Less than nothing. She looked at Dane, saw him disappearing into himself, and felt something fierce and protective rise up in her chest. "Everyone gather round," she called out, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. The men, Cole, Jimmy, Hank hobbling on his healing leg, formed a ragged circle around her. "Here's what we're going to do," Clara said, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "We're going to take inventory of what survived. We're going to salvage what we can from the barn, and then we're going to figure out how to move forward." "Clara," Dane started, his voice hollow. "No," she interrupted firmly. "We didn't fight the bank just to give up because of a fire. We're not done yet." "We don't have the resources to rebuild," Cole said quietly. "Winter's coming. Without that feed, without that equipment, then we get creative. We've been doing more with less since I got here. We just have to do it again." Clara turned to Jimmy. "How much hay did we lose?" "All of it. At least 2 months' worth." "Can we buy more?" Jimmy shook his head. "Not this late in the season. Everyone's holding on to their winter stores." "Then we graze the cattle harder. Rotate them to fresh pasture more frequently. Supplement with whatever we can find." Clara looked at Hank. "You're good with your hands. Can you repair harnesses?" "If I got leather and tools, yeah." "Then we buy leather scraps and you make what we need. It won't be pretty, but it'll work." She turned to Cole. "What about the structure itself? Can we salvage the walls?" Cole studied the barn critically. "Maybe. Depends how much damage the fire did to the foundation. But even if we can save the walls, we'd need timber for a new roof, nails, labor." "We'll worry about the roof in spring," Clara said. "For now, we just need the walls stable enough to provide some shelter. Can we do that?" Cole looked at her like she'd lost her mind, but slowly nodded. Yeah, we probably can." Clara turned to Dane, who'd been standing silent through the entire exchange. "What do you say, boss? We keep fighting?" Dane's eyes met hers, and she could see the war raging inside him. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to give up, to stop trying, to accept that he was cursed and everyone around him would pay for it. But then something shifted in his expression, something hard and determined and alive. "We keep fighting," he said, his voice rough but steady. The next weeks were a blur of exhausting, back-breaking work. They salvaged what they could from the barn, sorting through charred wood and twisted metal for anything usable. Clara oversaw the inventory while Dane and Cole worked on stabilizing the remaining walls, bracing them with whatever timber they could scavenge. Jimmy took on the job of herding the cattle to new pasture every few days, pushing himself and the horses to their limits to keep the animals fed. Hank, still recovering but determined to contribute, set up a workspace in the bunkhouse and started repairing old harnesses and making new ones from scraps of leather they bought in town. Clara threw herself into making the garden produce anything at all. The early vegetables were coming in now, meager but real: potatoes, carrots, some hardy greens. She harvested carefully, saving seeds for next year, using every scrap in meals that stretched their dwindling supplies. She also started baking bread to sell in town, rising before dawn to knead dough and tend the oven, then riding out twice a week to sell loaves to the general store and local families. The money was small, barely enough to cover the flour and yeast, but it was something. A trickle of income where before there'd been none. And slowly, painfully, they started to stabilize. The cattle were lean but alive. The chicken flock had grown to 12 birds, providing eggs they could eat or sell. The garden continued to produce, each harvest a small victory. The barn walls stood, weathered but solid, providing some protection from the wind even without a roof. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough to get them through winter, but it was progress. Clara was in the kitchen one evening, stirring a pot of vegetable soup, when Dane came in looking troubled. "We need to talk," he said. Clara's stomach clenched. Those words never preceded good news. "What's wrong?" "I got word from a cattle buyer down in Wyoming. Big operation looking to stock their range before winter. They're paying premium prices for healthy cattle." "That's good news, isn't it?" "It is, but there's a catch. I'd need to drive the herd down there myself. It's a 4-week journey, minimum. Maybe longer, depending on weather." Clara set down the spoon, turning to face him fully. 4 weeks. That'd put you getting back right before the first hard freeze. "I know, it's risky. But Clara, the money from this sale, it could save us. We could buy enough supplies to last through winter, maybe even start rebuilding properly. And if something goes wrong on the drive, if you hit bad weather or lose cattle or—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the fear that he might not come back at all. Dane crossed to her, taking her hands. "I'll come back. I promise you, I'll come back." "You can't promise that." "Yes, I can. Because I've finally got something worth coming back to." He pulled her close, pressing his forehead to hers. "I love you, Clara, and I will move heaven and earth to get back to you." Clara's throat tightened. "When would you leave?" 3 days. I need time to round up the cattle and prepare." 3 days. Not nearly enough time to say everything she needed to say to prepare for the reality of him being gone for a month. "I want to come with you," she said. "No." "Dane, no," he repeated firmly. "I need you here. The ranch needs you here. Cole and Jimmy and Hank, they'll work themselves to death if someone doesn't keep them in line. And if something happens, if the bank comes calling or supplies run out or anything goes wrong, you're the only one who can handle it." He was right. She knew he was right, but that didn't make it any easier. "I hate this," she whispered. "Me too. But it's what we have to do." Those 3 days passed in a frenzy of preparation. Dane worked with Cole and Jimmy to round up every head of cattle they could find, sorting out the healthiest for the drive. Clara packed supplies, food, medicine, spare clothes, everything Dane might need on a month-long journey through rough country. The night before he left, they lay together in Dane's bed, neither of them sleeping, just holding each other and trying to memorize the feeling. "Promise me something," Clara said into the darkness. "Anything. Promise me that if things go wrong, if the weather turns or the cattle scatter or anything happens, you'll turn back. Don't risk your life for this." Dane was quiet for a long moment. "I can't promise that." "Dane, because if I turn back, we lose everything. The ranch, our future, all of it. I can't let that happen. I won't." Clara felt tears burn her eyes. "I'd rather lose the ranch than lose you." "I know, but I need you to trust me. Trust that I know what I'm doing. Trust that I'll make it back to you." He turned to face her, his hand cupping her cheek. "Can you do that?" Clara wanted to say no, wanted to beg him to stay, to find some other way, to choose her over the ranch. But she understood what was really at stake. This wasn't just about money or land. This was about Dane proving to himself that he could succeed at something again, that he wasn't cursed, that he could protect what he loved instead of watching it die. So she nodded, even as tears slipped down her face. "I trust you." They made love with a desperation that bordered on violence. clinging to each other like they could somehow press their souls together and never be separated. And when dawn came, pale and cold, Clara held Dane one last time before letting him go. She stood on the porch with Cole, Jimmy, and Hank as Dane rode out, driving 30 head of cattle toward the south. He turned back once, raising his hand in farewell, and Clara raised hers in return. Then he disappeared over the ridge, and she was alone. The first week wasn't terrible. Clara threw herself into work, managing the ranch with a ruthless efficiency that kept everyone too busy to worry. She took over Dane's duties, checking the cattle that remained, overseeing repairs, managing the books. At night, she collapsed into bed exhausted, too tired to do anything but sleep. The second week was harder. News came from a neighboring ranch that early snows had hit the mountains. Travel through the passes would be treacherous. Clara tried not to think about Dane out there in the cold, tried not to imagine all the ways things could go wrong. She kept the men working, kept the ranch running, kept moving forward, because stopping meant thinking and thinking meant drowning in fear. The third week brought the first real storm. It hit fast and brutal, dumping a foot of snow overnight and driving temperatures below zero. Clara and the men worked frantically to protect what they could, bringing the chickens inside, covering the garden, making sure the remaining cattle had shelter. But all Clara could think about was Dane. Was he caught in this storm? Was he safe? Was he even alive? She stood at the window that night, staring out at the blizzard, and felt terror claw at her chest. 4 weeks, he'd said. It had been 3. Even if everything went perfectly, he wouldn't be back for at least another 7 days. 7 days felt like an eternity. The fourth week crawled by in agonizing slowness. The storm passed, leaving the world buried in white. Clara kept the household running, kept everyone fed and warm and working, but inside she felt like she was slowly coming apart. On the 28th day, Jimmy came running to the house, his face pale. "Rider coming up the road," he said breathlessly. "But it ain't the boss." Clara's heart stopped. She grabbed her coat and ran outside, shading her eyes against the snow glare to see a lone rider approaching. It was a man she didn't recognize, his horse lathered despite the cold. He pulled up in front of the house and dismounted stiffly. "You Clara Vance?" he asked. "I am. What's this about?" The man pulled an envelope from his coat. "Got a message from down south, about Dane Mercer." Clara's hand shook as she took the envelope. She stared at it, afraid to open it, afraid of what it might say. "Is he—" She couldn't finish the question. "You should read it," the man said quietly. Clara tore open the envelope with numb fingers. The message inside was brief, written in a hand she didn't recognize. "Accident on the trail. Mercer ranch owner injured. Come quick. Fletcher Station, Wyoming." The world tilted sideways. Clara gripped the porch rail to keep from falling, her breath coming in short gasps. "How bad?" she managed. "Don't know, ma'am. Just told to get this to you fast as I could." Clara looked at the man, then at the message, then at Cole and Jimmy, who'd come running at the commotion. "I'm going," she said, her voice steady despite the terror flooding her veins. "Clara, no," Cole started. "I'm going," she repeated, already moving toward the barn. "Jimmy, saddle the fastest horse we have. Cole, pack supplies, food, blankets, medicine, everything." "That's a week's ride in good weather," Cole protested. "With this snow, it could take twice that. You could get lost, freeze to death. I don't care." Clara turned to face him, her eyes blazing. "He went out there to save this ranch, to save all of us. And I'll be damned if I let him die alone in some frontier outpost." Something in her expression must have convinced them. Within an hour, Clara was mounted and ready, saddlebags packed with everything she might need. "You bring him home," Hank said from the bunkhouse door, his voice rough with emotion. Clara nodded once, then turned her horse south and rode. The journey was hell. The cold bit through every layer of clothing. The snow made the trail treacherous, forcing her to go slow when every instinct screamed to run. She stopped only when absolutely necessary, catching a few hours of sleep in her bedroll before pushing on. She passed other travelers who warned her about the weather, about bandits, about a dozen other dangers. She ignored them all. All that mattered was getting to Dane. On the 6th day, half frozen and running on fumes, she rode into Fletcher's station. It was barely a town. just a collection of rough buildings clustered around a trading post. She went straight to the largest building, a combination saloon and boarding house, and burst through the doors. "Where's Dane Mercer?" she demanded. A woman behind the bar jerked her thumb toward the stairs. "Room 3. Doc's with him now." Clara took the stairs 2 at a time, her heart pounding. She found room 3 and shoved the door open without knocking. A gray-haired man looked up from where he knelt beside a bed. In the bed, covered in bandages and barely conscious, lay Dane. "You family?" the doctor asked. "Close enough." "How bad is he?" "Couple broken ribs, gash on his head, possible internal bleeding. He got trampled in a stampede 3 days ago. Lucky to be alive, honestly." Clara crossed to the bed, her hand finding Dane's. His skin was hot with fever, his breathing shallow and labored. "Dane," she whispered. I'm here, and you're going to be fine." His eyes flickered open, glassy and unfocused. "Clara?" "Yeah, it's me. How?" He coughed, wincing in pain. "How'd you get here?" "Same way you would have if it was me lying there. I rode straight through hell and didn't stop." She smoothed his hair back from his forehead, her hand trembling. "You scared me, you stubborn fool." "Sorry," he rasped. "Cattle spooked. Couldn't get clear." "Shh. Don't talk. Just rest." The doctor cleared his throat. "He needs to stay put for at least a week. Moving him now could kill him." Clara nodded without taking her eyes off Dane. "Then we stay." She didn't leave his side for the next 7 days. She tended his wounds, forced water and broth down his throat, sat with him through the fevers and the nightmares. When he was strong enough to talk, he told her about the drive, how successful it had been right up until the last day, how they'd gotten spooked by a wolf and stampeded, how he'd been caught in the middle of it. "Got the money, though," he said with a weak smile, gesturing to a bag in the corner. "Sold every head for premium price." Clara wanted to yell at him, to tell him the money didn't matter if he'd died getting it, but she could see the pride in his eyes, the satisfaction of having accomplished what he'd set out to do. So instead she kissed his forehead and whispered, "You did good." On the 8th day, the doctor declared Dane well enough to travel if they took it slow. Clara rented a wagon and made a bed in the back, padding it with every blanket she could find. They started the long journey home, Dane sleeping most of the time while Clara drove, her eyes constantly scanning for threats. They traveled slow, stopping frequently to let Dane rest. What had taken Clara 6 days going out took them nearly 2 weeks coming back. But finally, on a cold morning in late November, they crested the rise and saw the ranch spread out below them. Cole and Jimmy were waiting in the yard, their faces breaking into grins when they saw the wagon. They helped Dane inside, settling him in his own bed with a gentleness that brought tears to Clara's eyes. "Welcome home, boss," Cole said gruffly. Dane managed a smile. "Good to be back." That night, lying beside Dane in the bed they now shared openly, Clara listened to his steady breathing and felt something settle deep in her bones. They'd made it. Against impossible odds, through fire and fear and distance, they'd made it. And as she drifted off to sleep, her hand clasped in Dane's, Clara knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Home. Winter arrived in earnest the day after they returned, bringing with it snow that fell thick and heavy, blanketing the ranch in white silence. Clara watched from the kitchen window as the world disappeared under the storm, and felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. They were home. They were together. And for the first time in months, they had the resources to survive what was coming. The money from the cattle sale sat in a lockbox under Dane's bed. More cash than the ranch had seen in years. Enough to buy supplies, pay down debt, and maybe, just maybe, give them breathing room to build something sustainable. But first, Dane had to heal. Clara enforced his bed rest with an iron will that surprised everyone, especially Dane himself. When he tried to get up to check on the ranch, she pushed him back down. When he argued that he was fine, she pointed to the dark bruises still covering his ribs and the way he winced with every breath. "You're not fine," she said firmly. "And you're not going anywhere until the doctor says otherwise. The ranch needs you alive, so lie down, shut up, and let me take care of things." Dane stared at her for a long moment, then slowly settled back against the pillows. "You're terrifying when you're determined. You know that?" "Good. Maybe you'll actually listen to me." She left him there and went to find Cole, who was in the barn assessing what repairs they could tackle before the snow got too deep. "How's he doing?" Cole asked without looking up from the broken stall door he was examining. "Stubborn, thinks he should be up working." "That sounds like the boss." Clara crossed her arms, looking around the damaged barn. Even with the walls stabilized, it was a skeleton of what it had been. "We need to prioritize. What's most critical?" Cole straightened, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Water system. The pump's been freezing at night. If we don't fix it soon, we'll be hauling water by hand all winter." "What else?" "The chicken coop needs insulation, or we'll lose birds to the cold. The fence line on the east pasture is still down. That's where we'll need to keep the cattle close for winter feeding. And the roof on the bunkhouse has been leaking. Won't matter much until the snow melts, but then it'll be a problem." Clara mentally calculated costs and priorities. The water system first. That affects everything. Then the chicken coop and the fence. The bunkhouse roof can wait until spring. "You want me to ride into town for supplies?" "No. I'll go. I need to make arrangements with the bank anyway. Pay down what we owe and make sure they know we're solvent." Clara pulled her coat tighter. "How's Jimmy doing?" Cole's expression darkened slightly. "Working himself too hard, trying to make up for us being short-handed. I told him to ease up, but the kid doesn't listen. I'll talk to him. And Hank?" "Making good progress. Should be back to full strength by spring." Clara nodded, filing away the information. "Keep everyone focused on what we can control. I'll be back from town by tomorrow night." She rode out before dawn the next morning, the money carefully hidden in her saddlebags. The trip to town took most of the day through snow-covered trails, but Clara pushed through, driven by the need to secure their position before anything else could go wrong. The bank was nearly empty when she arrived, just a few customers conducting quiet business. Clara walked straight to the same clerk who'd first dismissed her weeks ago. "I need to speak with Mr. Morrison," she said. The clerk's eyes widened slightly in recognition. "I'll see if he's available." This time, Morrison came out to meet her personally, his smile tight and professional. "Miss Vance, what can I do for you?" Clara pulled out a leather pouch heavy with coins and bills. "I'm here to make a payment on the Mercer Ranch loan, $1,500. Morrison's eyebrows shot up. "That's quite a substantial payment." "The cattle drive was successful. We're settling our debts." Clara met his gaze steadily. "I'll also need a receipt showing our current balance and confirming our extension through spring." Morrison's jaw tightened, but he couldn't refuse. He counted the money carefully, made notations in his ledger, and provided Clara with documentation showing their new balance. The loan wasn't paid off, not by a long shot, but they'd cut it nearly in half. "You'll still need to make regular payments," Morrison said, sliding the papers across his desk. "We're aware. We'll be here every month." Clara tucked the documents into her bag. "And Mr. Morrison, we'll be watching the calculations very carefully from now on." His smile turned brittle. "I'm sure you will." Clara spent the rest of the day purchasing supplies: tools, lumber, chicken feed, flour, salt, everything they'd need to get through winter. She arranged for delivery of the larger items and packed what she could carry onto her horse. She was loading the last of the supplies when a voice behind her made her freeze. Clara Vance. Well, I'll be damned. She turned to find a man leaning against the hitching post, his smile familiar in a way that made her stomach turn. Thomas Greer. She'd known him years ago, back when she'd worked in a saloon in Wyoming. He'd been a card dealer then, smooth-talking and dangerous. "Thomas," she said neutrally, "what brings you to Montana?" "Looking for opportunities, same as always." His eyes raked over her, assessing. "Heard you'd settled down, ranching, of all things. Never took you for the domestic type." "People change." "Do they?" He pushed off the post, moving closer. "Or do they just pretend to until something better comes along?" Clara's hand moved to the knife at her belt. "I'm not interested in whatever you're selling, Thomas. Move along." "Now, is that any way to treat an old friend?" His smile widened, showing too many teeth, especially when that friend might have information you'd find valuable. Despite her better judgment, Clara paused. "What kind of information?" "The kind about a certain banker who's been making some questionable investments with depositor funds. The kind that might give you even more leverage if you needed it." Thomas tilted his head. "For a price, of course." "I don't need your help." "Maybe not now, but insurance is always useful." He pulled out a card and pressed it into her hand. When you change your mind, you can find me at the Silver Dollar. I'll be around for a while. He walked away before Clara could refuse the card. She stared at it for a moment, then shoved it deep into her pocket and tried to forget about it. The ride back to the ranch was slower, weighed down by supplies. Clara used the time to think, to plan, to imagine the future they were building. The encounter with Thomas had unsettled her, reminded her of the life she'd left behind, but she pushed the unease aside. That wasn't her world anymore. This was. She arrived at the ranch after dark to find lantern light glowing in the windows and smoke rising from the chimney. The sight filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the knowledge that she was coming home to something real. Cole and Jimmy met her in the yard, helping unload the supplies. Clara asked after Dane and learned he'd finally stayed in bed all day, though he'd driven everyone crazy with questions about ranch operations. He's going to be impossible when he can finally get up, Jimmy said, grinning. Let him try, Clara said. I'll just put him back down. She found Dane sitting up in bed, a ledger spread across his lap. He looked up when she entered, his face lighting with relief. You made it back. Did you doubt I would? Clara sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. Always worry when you're gone. Dane set aside the ledger and pulled her close. How'd it go? Paid down the loan, bought supplies, made sure Morrison knows we're not going anywhere. She leaned into him, breathing in the familiar scent of him. We're going to make it, Dane. We're actually going to make it. His arms tightened around her. Because of you. All of this is because of you. No, it's because of us, because we fought for it together. They sat like that for a long while, holding each other in the quiet warmth of the room, listening to the wind howl outside and feeling grateful for walls and warmth and each other. The next morning, Clara woke to find Dane already up and dressed, moving gingerly but determinedly. What do you think you're doing? She demanded. It's been 2 weeks. I can't just lie in bed forever. The doctor said 3 weeks minimum. The doctor isn't here, and I'm going stir-crazy. Dane pulled on his boots with visible effort. I'm not doing anything strenuous, just walking around, checking on things. You can supervise if it makes you feel better. Clara wanted to argue, but she could see the determination in his eyes. And truthfully, she understood. She'd feel the same way. Fine, but the second you look tired, you're coming back to bed. Yes, ma'am. They walked the property together, Dane moving slowly but steadily. Clara watched him take in the changes, the repaired pump, the insulated chicken coop, the new fence posts waiting to be set. She saw pride and gratitude warring with guilt on his face. You did all this while I was laid up, he said quietly. Cole and Jimmy did most of it. I just told them where to start. Still, you kept everything together, kept everyone working. Hell, you rode through a blizzard to find me. He stopped, turning to face her. I don't know what I did to deserve you, Clara Vance. You pulled a stranger out of danger and asked for nothing in return. That's what you did. Clara took his hands. And then you gave me a place to belong when I didn't think I'd ever find one again. Dane cupped her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. Marry me. Clara's breath caught. What? Marry me. Make this official. Make this ranch ours, not just mine. Make everything we're building something we own together. His eyes were intense, almost desperate. I know it's fast. I know we've only known each other a few months. But Clara, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. You're sure? Because once we do this, I'm not going anywhere. You'll be stuck with me. That's all I want, to be stuck with you for the rest of my life. Then yes, Clara whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Dane kissed her there in the middle of the snow-covered ranch, and Clara felt something click into place so perfectly it was like finding a puzzle piece she hadn't known was missing. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the ranch. Cole stood up as Dane's witness, and they borrowed the wife of a neighboring rancher to stand up for Clara. The justice of the peace came out from town, performing the ceremony in the rebuilt kitchen while Jimmy and Hank looked on. Clara wore a simple dress she'd bought in town, nothing fancy, but Dane looked at her like she was wearing the finest silk. And when he slipped a plain gold band on her finger, a ring that had been his grandmother's, Clara felt richer than she'd ever been. That night, lying tangled together in their bed as husband and wife, They talked about the future in concrete terms for the first time. We diversify, Clara said, her head resting on Dane's chest. Cattle will always be the primary income, but we can't rely on them alone. The chickens are doing well. We should expand that operation, maybe even look into selling eggs and meat in bulk to restaurants in Helena. The garden too, Dane added. Come spring, we double its size. Sell vegetables at market, maybe even preserve and can some for winter sales. And we need to think about hiring more help. We can't keep running on 4 people. 5 once Hank's fully recovered. Dane was quiet for a moment. That costs money. So we make more money. We work harder, smarter. We take the foundation we've built and we expand it. Clara propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him. This place can be more than it was, Dane. It can be something new, something better. Well, you really believe that? I know it. And she did. For the first time in her life, Clara could see a clear path forward. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worth having ever was. But it was possible. Real. Achievable. Winter passed in a blur of work and planning. They ordered seeds for spring planting, researched chicken breeds, made connections with potential buyers. Dane's strength returned fully, and he threw himself into preparations with the same intensity Clara had come to expect. Cole proved invaluable, his years of experience providing insights they'd have missed otherwise. Jimmy matured under the increased responsibility, becoming more confident and capable. And Hank, finally healed, returned to work with a determination to prove his worth. Spring arrived like a promise kept. The snow melted, revealing ground ready to be worked. Clara and Dane stood in what would become the expanded garden, planning where to put what crops, arguing good-naturedly about spacing and varieties. We should put the tomatoes here, Clara said, gesturing to the south-facing slope. Tomatoes need support structures. That's too much work for this year. Then we build support structures. Dane, if we're going to do this, we do it right. He laughed, pulling her close. You're relentless, you know that? You love it. I do. I really do. They broke ground on the garden expansion that afternoon, working side by side in the warming sun. By evening, they'd marked out plots and started preparing the soil. It was backbreaking work, but satisfying in a way Clara had never experienced before. This was hers. Theirs. Something they were building from nothing. That night, sitting around the dinner table with Cole, Jimmy, and Hank, Clara looked around at the faces that had become family and felt a surge of fierce protectiveness. I want to propose something, she said, setting down her fork. Everyone looked at her. We make this official, not just me and Dane, but all of us. We turn this into a real partnership. Everyone who works this land gets a share of the profits, not just wages. We build this place together. We succeed or fail together. Cole's eyebrows rose. You're talking about making us partners? In a way, you'd still answer to Dane and me on major decisions, but you'd have a stake. A real stake. Something to build a future on. The men exchanged glances, uncertainty and hope mixing on their faces. Why would you do that? Jimmy asked quietly. Because you've earned it, Dane said, speaking up for the first time. Every one of you has stuck with this place when you could have left, when you should have left. You've worked for scraps and promises, and you've never complained. That kind of loyalty deserves more than just wages. Hank cleared his throat roughly. That's mighty generous of you, boss. It's not generous. It's smart. And it's right. Clara looked at each of them in turn. What do you say? Cole spoke first. I'm in. Me too, Jimmy said, grinning. Hank nodded. Count me in. Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest. This was more than just a business arrangement. This was building something that would outlast all of them. A legacy. The spring planting happened in a frenzy of activity. They worked from dawn until well past dark, getting seeds in the ground, setting up irrigation, building the support structures for tomatoes and beans. The chicken coop was expanded to hold 50 birds, and they purchased young pullets that would start laying by summer. Clara also made good on her plan to sell bread in town, but she expanded it. She started making pies, jams, preserved vegetables, anything she could sell at market. Twice a week she'd load up the wagon and head to town, returning with cash and orders for more. The money started coming in. Slowly at first, then with increasing steadiness. They paid down more of the loan. They bought better tools, quality livestock, supplies that didn't fall apart after one use, and the ranch started to transform. The burned barn was rebuilt, this time with a proper roof and reinforced walls. The fence lines were repaired and extended. The garden exploded with growth, producing more vegetables than they knew what to do with. Clara taught herself canning and preservation, putting up jars that would feed them through next winter and provide product to sell. By midsummer, they'd hired 2 more hands, young men looking for work and a chance to build something. Clara vetted them carefully, and they proved their worth quickly. The ranch was thriving, actually genuinely thriving, but success brought its own challenges. The neighboring ranchers who'd watched the Mercer Ranch struggle for years started to take notice. Some were supportive, asking for advice, forming partnerships for shared resources. Others were less friendly, viewing the ranch's recovery as a threat. One of those was Wade Cunningham, who owned the largest spread in the territory. He showed up one afternoon in late July, riding in with 3 of his men like he owned the place. Clara was in the garden when they arrived, her hands dirty and her back aching from hours of work. She straightened when she saw them, wiping her hands on her apron. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" she called out. Cunningham dismounted, his eyes sweeping over the ranch with undisguised assessment. He was a big man, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. "I'm here to speak with Mercer," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed. "About what?" "Ranch business. Now fetch him." Clara felt her spine stiffen. "Mr. Mercer is in the north pasture checking fence lines. I'm Clara Mercer, his wife and co-owner of this ranch. Anything you need to discuss with him, you can discuss with me." Cunningham's eyes narrowed. "This is between ranchers. Run along and get your husband." Before Clara could respond, Dane appeared from the barn, Cole and Jimmy flanking him. He must have seen the riders arrive. "Mr. Cunningham," Dane said, his voice neutral but his posture tense. "What brings you to my property?" "Business proposition. I'm buying up land in the territory, consolidating operations." "I'll give you a fair price for your spread." "The ranch isn't for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price. I'll give you twice what it's worth." "No." Cunningham's expression hardened. "Don't be stupid, Mercer. This place was dying 6 months ago. One bad season, and you'll be right back where you started. Take the money while you can." "I said no." Dane's voice was steel. "Now get off my land. You're making a mistake. That's my right. This is my land, my ranch, my decision. And I'm telling you to leave." For a tense moment, nobody moved. Then Cunningham remounted his horse, his face dark with anger. "You'll regret this," he said. "I doubt it." Cunningham and his men rode off, kicking up dust. Clara waited until they were out of sight before turning to Dane. "That's going to come back on us," she said quietly. "I know. But I'm not selling. Not to him. Not to anyone." Clara took his hand. "Then we make sure this place is strong enough to withstand whatever he throws at us." And they did. They spent the rest of summer and early fall fortifying their position. They formed partnerships with other small ranchers, creating a coalition that could stand against Cunningham's attempts to monopolize the territory. They secured contracts with buyers in multiple cities, diversifying their income streams. They built up cash reserves and paid off the bank loan completely. By the time the first snow fell in November, the Mercer Ranch was debt-free and profitable for the first time in years. Clara stood on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold, and felt a sense of accomplishment so profound it brought tears to her eyes. They'd done it. Against every odd, against all the fear and doubt and disaster, they'd built something real and lasting. Dane came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything. Nothing. How far we've come." "We've come pretty far." He turned her in his arms, his hands settling on her hips. "And I've been thinking it's time we made this place even more of a home." Clara looked up at him, seeing something in his eyes that made her breath catch. "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe it's time we started a family. Fill this house with more than just the 2 of us." Clara's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, and she saw Dane's eyes widen. "Are you?" "I think so. I wasn't sure. Didn't want to say anything until I was certain, but Dane swept her up in his arms, spinning her around while Clara laughed, her hands clutching his shoulders. "We're having a baby," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "We're having a baby," Clara confirmed, and felt joy flood through her so intensely it was almost painful. They told the ranch hands that night over dinner, and the celebration that followed was loud and raucous and filled with more laughter than the ranch had heard in years. Cole proposed a toast, Jimmy got drunk and sentimental, and Hank carved a wooden rattle that was more enthusiasm than skill, but perfect nonetheless. As winter settled in and Clara's belly began to swell with new life, the ranch seemed to settle too, finding a rhythm and balance that felt sustainable. The debt was paid, the operations were profitable, the land was healing, and one cold February morning Clara gave birth to a daughter with Dane's dark eyes and her own stubborn chin. They named her Sarah, after the woman who'd first built this place, and Clara held the tiny, perfect weight of her and felt the final piece of her heart slot into place. This was what she'd been searching for all those years, not just a place, but a purpose. Not just survival, but a life worth living. Spring came again, bringing with it the first anniversary of Clara's arrival at the ranch. She stood in the kitchen early one morning, the same kitchen she'd first cleaned a year ago, and marveled at how different everything looked. The walls had been repainted, new curtains hung in the windows. The table was sturdy and well-maintained, surrounded by chairs that didn't wobble. The shelves were stocked with food, the pantry full of preserved goods from last year's harvest. And in a cradle by the window, baby Sarah slept peacefully, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Dane came in from morning chores, stomping snow from his boots. He'd filled out over the past year, the gaunt hollows in his face replaced with healthy weight. His eyes, once so empty, now burned with life and purpose. "Morning," he said, crossing to kiss Clara before peering into the cradle at their daughter. "She sleep through the night?" "Mostly. Woke up once, around 3. You should have gotten me." "You needed the rest. Besides, I don't mind." Clara poured him coffee, her movements automatic and comfortable. "Cole and Jimmy are planning to start on the new barn extension today if the weather holds." "Good. We'll need the extra space once the spring calves start arriving." Dane wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his head on her shoulder. "Hard to believe it's only been a year. Feels like a lifetime. Feels like home." Clara turned in his arms, reaching up to cup his face. "It is home, for all of us." The years that followed brought their share of challenges. Droughts that tested their water systems, market fluctuations that required creativity and adaptation, the constant work of maintaining and expanding operations. But they faced each challenge together, as partners, as family. The ranch grew. They added more cattle, expanded the garden into a full market operation, built additional housing for the growing number of hands they employed. The chicken operation became so successful they started supplying restaurants in 3 cities. Clara's bread and preserves became famous throughout the territory. People traveled hours just to buy her strawberry jam and apple pies. She hired help for the kitchen, teaching other women the skills her mother had taught her, creating jobs and opportunity where none had existed before. Dane took on the role of leader in the ranching community, helping other struggling operations find their footing, sharing the strategies that had saved his own place. He became someone people looked to for guidance, for fairness, for strength, and their family grew. 3 years after Sarah came a son they named James. 2 years after that, another daughter they called Elizabeth. The house filled with noise and laughter and life. The sound of children playing in the yard replaced the silence that had once been so oppressive. The kitchen, once a symbol of neglect, became the heart of the home where family and friends gathered for meals that lasted hours. On the 5th anniversary of Clara's arrival, they threw a celebration. Not just for the ranch, but for the community they'd built around it. Neighboring ranchers came with their families. The ranch hands, now numbering 12, brought friends from town. The barn Clara had helped rebuild was cleared and decorated, just as Dane had described from years before. Musicians played, people danced, children ran wild while their parents laughed and talked and celebrated a success that belonged to all of them. Clara stood at the edge of it all, watching the joy she'd helped create, and felt Dane's hand slip into hers. "You thinking about that first day?" he asked. "Actually, no, I'm thinking about tomorrow. And all the tomorrows after that." "Good ones?" Clara looked up at him, at the man who'd saved her life without knowing it, who'd given her a purpose when she'd been drifting, who'd loved her when she'd forgotten how to love herself. The best ones, she said. And she meant it. Because home wasn't something you found by accident. It wasn't something that just appeared when you needed it. Home was something you fought for, something you built with your own hands and heart and stubborn refusal to quit. It was the people you chose and who chose you back. It was the land you poured your sweat into and the legacy you left behind. Claire had come to the ranch to pay a debt, but what she'd found was so much more. She'd found love, purpose, family, a future that stretched out bright and possible before her. She'd found home, and she would never let it go. Years later, when Clara was old and her children were grown with children of their own, she would sit on that same porch and watch the sun set over land that had been transformed from a dying ranch into a thriving legacy. She would hold Dane's weathered hand in her own and remember that cold morning when she'd first arrived, desperate and determined to repay an impossible debt. She would remember the fear and the hunger and the moments when giving up would have been so much easier than fighting, and she would smile. Because in the end, the debt she'd thought she owed had been nothing compared to the gift she'd received. A life worth living, a love worth fighting for, a home worth keeping, and that, Clara knew, was worth more than all the gold in Montana.